560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So I got around to seeing The Covenant this weekend. Have you seen that yet? The Jake Gyllenhaal movie?
I have not.
So, for a high production, high cost, movie, blockbuster-ish type movie like The Covenant, it's good. There's a few gaps in the plot, but it's really good. And Gyllenhaal was good. And this Iraqi-born Danish actor named Dar Salim is really good, too. I wasn't really familiar with his work, although I think he's won some accolades for other projects overseas. But the two of them together were really good. And for those of you who haven't seen the trailer...
Yeah, what's the premise of it?
It's a fictional story, but it's a fictional story that's reflective of reality. It's a story about Jake Gyllenhaal and... American soldiers in Afghanistan, and he's part of a unit that goes to try to find IED factories of the Taliban. And the character played by Dar Salim is the interpreter they pay to embed with his unit. So, right, he speaks the language and knows the topography. And anyway, without giving too much away, the general plot is Gyllenhaal gets shot, and the interpret and the rest of his I won't say that. And the interpreter brings him back to Bagram Air Force Base. Traversing mountainous regions and dodging Taliban checkpoints to get him back, but then he's left behind. And when Gyllenhaal recovers and realizes that the interpreter who saved his life has been left behind, he moves to get him out.
Okay.
And it's well done. It's action packed, but it's a good story. But as I said, it's a story that's reflective of reality, and it reminded me that we have not been as dogged as we should be on this story. We talked about it at the time of the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, that we owed a duty not just to Americans, but also to the Afghan nationals who served as interpreters with our armed forces, who we promised to get out, to get visas for themselves and their families, to get out of Afghanistan and safe and to safety in the United States. We made a promise. And 300 some interpreters have been murdered by the Taliban who work for our armed services. And thousands more are still there in hiding, I believe, at this point. We haven't kept our promise. And to me, that is unconscionable. So on the one hand, it's a great story about American soldiers and an American soldier and an Afghan interpreter. In another way, it's a story that at least Guy Ritchie, who wrote and directed this, did a good job, as he usually does. If his point was to get me upset, then he accomplished his point. Here was Jake Gyllenhaal actually talking about the movie when they were making the rounds promoting it.
Well, first of all, I've wanted to work with Guy Ritchie for a long time. There was something about this story that was just, it was a parable, It was about doing good reluctantly. I feel like America is made up of heroes and sometimes reluctant ones, but that is our fabric. That is who we are. And I felt that when I read it. I felt like it made me proud to be an American. And in that way, I wanted to be a part of it.
I appreciate that perspective from Gyllenhaal, too. You don't get that kind of proud to be an American talk from Hollywood very often. But what about this? What about this duty we own, this covenant commitment that we made to those Afghan interpreters who risked their lives, who served us, who wanted to repel the Taliban, who wanted a freer Afghanistan, and who we left behind? What does that say about us? And how does that implicate our national security interests if people see this and they can't trust America to keep her promises? For more on this and other topics, please be joined by Dakota Wood, who served America for 2 decades in the Marine Corps. He's a senior research fellow for the defense programs at the Heritage Foundation. Dakota, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's a great way to start the week. Thanks for having me on.
What about where we are with keeping our promises to those Afghan nationals who served with our men and women in the uniform?
Well, I think your final comment really is the one to lead with, and that is, how do other people view the United States? So we will want to make nice with Indonesia or the Philippines or country of Jordan or whatever it might be, and we've got common security concerns. We want to affect trade. We're going to be there with you. Keep those pesky Chinese out of your system and economy and all that stuff. And the people on the other end there look at the United States and say, well, what did you do right in Vietnam, or what did you do in Afghanistan or in Iraq, or many of these other places where we've been, and the going gets dicey, or we get tired of being involved, and so we leave and leave all these people just hanging out there, right? And so it's this international perception, or the foreign perception of the United States, that really makes it hard to establish long-term relationships that are in the best interests of Americans. American workers, we want to produce things and sell it abroad. We want to be able to travel and all those sorts of issues. So if you had a friend or a business associate and you kept making these promises, but you always fell through, right, in keeping them long term, well, you're not going to have very many business associates that want to keep doing business with you. So on the national interest side, that's a real problem.
Well, something else too. I mean, particularly on this weekend, when you are listening to the bloviations from all these sanctuary city mayors and politicians and a president and his party that's been for open borders in a de facto sense and created this chaos at the border. But so sanctuary cities for people who come here illegally, we're going to provide sanctuary and benefits and so on and so forth. And we leave people who served our country and now are at the mercy of these Islamic fascists in Afghanistan. We leave them and their families to rot or to be beheaded in Afghanistan. What kind of sense does that make? How it's an indefensible posture we're taking.
Well, it makes people feel good to make promises or to really raise up and hand wave these great values until the going gets tough, right? Until it starts to actually cost you something. So, using the sanctuary cities as an example, it was railing against the Trump administration, railing against the state of Texas and other places, and the hated Customs and Border Patrol agents or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the ICE guys, how bad those people were. Well, let's, take 10 or 20,000 of these illegal immigrants and dump them in your city and see how that sits well with you. And it doesn't at all. So I think it's an apt analogy where how America is perceived and how we view ourselves. Do we really hold true to the values and principles that we say are so important? If we want representative governments elsewhere, if we want to champion human rights and freedom of expression and association and all those things that just have made our country what it has been for a really long time, and we go in and we spend how many American lives and how many billions of dollars to try to improve things. Now, are we the world's policemen? No, we're not. But we do a lot of these things because it's in America's interest. And then when you cut and run, like the Biden administration did a year and a half, that you already talked about, right? And you leave all these people hanging out there, it's rightful for them to say, well, what was all the classes you gave us, about representative democracy and educating our young women and girls and having an opportunity, to live a life when now we're under the boot heel of the Taliban. Women have been evicted, from schools and businesses. People are living in fear of their lives, as you aptly pointed out with these interpreters and all that stuff. So it just doesn't play well, and I think it's a black mark on our own character if we don't push through with the promises we make. Geopolitics is a messy business, right? And sometimes you got to do things that you wish you hadn't done, but the outcomes, if you don't get involved, are even worse. The aid we're giving to Ukraine. Is it a good day for America if Russia dominates, a good part of Europe. And it's not. The same thing with China or Iran or any of these other things.
Well, is there a plan currently underway to help some of those interpreters that we left behind? Or is that just smoke and mirrors?
Not really. It's rhetoric out of the White House. But, it's the same thing about, hey, we can pull every American out. And then from long range, over the horizon, we'll know when there are problems percolating up in Afghanistan and respond lightly and quick. So, there's nothing to worry about here. But the evidence is so polar opposite of that. We left Americans in Sudan here just recently, right? While other countries are getting their citizens out, the United States says, hey, if you can make your way 500 miles to the coastline, maybe we'll have a ship there to pick you up, but you're kind of on your own because it's too dangerous for the American military to come in and evacuate you, right? So I just don't put any faith in this White House the same message they're delivering about the border, right?
It's such a sad commentary. Yeah. And Sudan, a more recent example, is also a sad commentary. I mean, I remember from the Afghan withdrawal though too, because we talked about it. We talked to individuals that were involved in it. You did have, a la the Jake Gyllenhaal character in The Covenant. You did have former military who had served in Afghanistan who scrambled their own missions to try to get people out. So that it speaks to the character of our fighting men and women, but then we have a government, we have policy leaders that don't live up to that same ideal, and it's just and frankly, it's a failure of the press corps too. We should be holding politicians' feet to the fire by talking about this more, by trying to tell the stories of people that are over there that served our country heroically and who are left with an unkept promise from America.
So the biggest problem I've got in working in D.C., other than the traffic, is the gap that exists between political rhetoric and on-the-ground realities, right? So what you're talking about is, the press and others bringing actual hard evidence, to light, to say this is the actual condition on the ground or the lives that are being lived by people hiding in fear, et cetera, as opposed to these kind of policy ideations, this lofty theoretical rhetoric that's easy to spout from a podium, they're at the White House in a press conference, and then you talk to a soldier or sailor or an aid worker and what they're actually dealing with in the real world. So that rhetoric reality gap is what needs to be exposed and brought to the attention of the American public, and that's the role of the media, the press corps, I believe, and they do a great job when they're doing that.
Oh, remember when the CDC tried to stop a plane of Americans leaving Afghanistan because of COVID? Mm-hmm. I thought I was going to lose my mind. That is how ridiculous. Like, who cares? Their lives, they're going to get murdered. Get them on the plane. Who cares?
Yeah, they could have gotten on a freighter, made their way to Latin America, and come up across the southern border. They would have had an easier time of it. Trying to get back
yeah, that's true.
Country.
Really. You mentioned Russia and Ukraine. I wanted to get your reaction to what former President Trump had to say about Russia and Ukraine at that town hall he did for CNN last week. Much to the applause of the audience that was comprised of New Hampshire Republican primary voters and undecideds. Take a listen.
And even the Democrats admit that. Putin knew it would have never happened, and his pipeline would have never happened. A lot of things would have never happened, but this would never happen. And all those dead people, both Russian and Ukrainian, they wouldn't be dead today. And all those cities that are blown up and disintegrated right to the ground, that wouldn't have happened. Okay, now, here's the problem. We've given so far $171 billion. They've given, meaning European Union, which is approximately the same size altogether as our economy. They've given about 20. So we're at 170, let's say, and they're at 20. You don't have to know too much about history to realize, or geography, to realize that they're a little bit more affected than we are, okay? So they've got to put up a lot more money because they're taking advantage of us like every other country did. I have a very good relationship with President Zelensky because, as you know, he backed me up with the phony impeachment hoax number one when he said the president didn't do anything wrong. So I happen to like. Yeah, that's right. And I was totally exonerated, by the way. Just a waste of time and money.
You were impeached over that. You were impeached over that. But let's stay on topic here, Mr. President, because the question is, would you give Ukraine weapons and funding?
I was impeached by a crazy woman named Nancy Pelosi.
But the question here is, would you give Ukraine weapons and funding if you were elected?
I would sit down. Let me just put it a nicer way. If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
How would you settle that war in one day?
Because I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over. It'll be absolutely over.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people and breaking down this country. Now,
Dakota Wood, what do you think, both on the European contributions piece as well as the brokering a peace?
Well, I think it goes back to a rhetoric. I think it's easy to say the things that Trump was saying. I do think he would be much more effective than Biden has been. But it's easy to say things on a stage and to actually implement them in the real world. Bringing it to an end in one day. If you're Ukraine and you've seen your people raped and murdered and tortured, your cities destroyed, it's not going to be easy to say, okay, let's call a ceasefire and we'll just harden the lines and then figure out what the way forward is. I mean, they're just not going to do that because of the losses incurred. For Putin, his reputation and 200,000 casualties, 250,000 is on the line as well. So I think it would be more difficult to reach a conclusion than what the former president is talking about, but I do think he would be more effective than the Biden team. And usually he kind of exaggerates numbers anyway. It's not 170 billion. You'd have to account for just so much stuff that goes to Europe anyway. But he's right. The Europeans should be doing more, but you can't depend on them always doing more. And so then you come back to what are our interests, the United States, and then you look through that lens to see, is a Russian win good or bad for America, right? I mean, how that war ends and who has lost what territory, and then is in a better position to continue pushing forward their interests. What does that world look like? So I applaud what President Trump was saying on that stage. I think it's more difficult to accomplish than what he was getting across, but, look at the nature of that interview and the points that were being made. And he's absolutely right in terms of being impeached. If you've got a Democratic-controlled Congress, then they were going to push forward their agenda regardless of what the evidence was. And by that, we can look at, the whole Biden family and Hunter and laptops and all the other things where the truth is now starting to get out. And, the system was against the former president, from the day he entered office.
I wanted to go back to the border because Mr. 10% and his entire kick line of acolytes were out in force over the weekend at commencement addresses and on the Sunday talk shows, telling everyone that the greatest threat to domestic tranquility in the United States is white supremacy. How did you react to that? Is that true? And how did you react?
No, it's not. It's not true. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. If you look at the totality of the United States and the history over time, America has made more progress in more areas, whether it's economic opportunity, racial harmony in many ways. I mean, if you look at our own history, the changes that have been made across our country, how just about anybody from any background can ascend to the highest levels of political power, the sports world, entertainment industry, business, I mean, you name it. So I just don't understand how with a straight face they can say that white supremacy is the greatest threat to the United States. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. The Department of Defense spent a couple of years investigating this phenomenon, and out of 2 million people, active and reserve, they found something like 25 people that could be linked to social media posts and those sorts of things. So it's like zero is what it occurs in the military. And I think, if you travel the width and breadth of our country, which many of us have done, how do people get along together, and workmates and, colleagues and sports team buddies and all that kind of good stuff. So it's just nonsense, and they're pandering to a woke crowd, trying to get applause and honorary degrees. And it bears no reality, no reference to reality as you or I would know it.
He is Dakota Wood. He served America for 2 decades in the Marine Corps. He is a senior research fellow for defense programs at the Heritage Foundation. Dakota Wood, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, looking forward to